Mayhew noticed that incumbents of both parties were winning re-election by larger and larger margins, a finding that was inconsistent with previous explanations, and he developed 5 hypotheses to explain incumbents' growing advantages. His work sparked an explosion of interest in congressional elections. The literature in congressional elections, once a backwater, is now one of the most distinguished literatures in American politics. The very same year, Congress, the Electoral Connection, revolutionized the study of Congress as an institution. Before 1974, economic-style theorizing had yet to appear in any major work on Congress. Soon after 1974, it became the dominant approach. Absent this elegant book, rational choice theory would no doubt have made inroads into the study of legislatures, but it would probably have done so slowly, as it did in the study of bureaucracies, interest groups, regulatory agencies, and the presidency. What Mayhew did was to make a case against other forms of theorizing and to show the power of rational choice theory for understanding the organization of Congress and the behavior of individual legislators. In 1991, he published Divided We Govern, which changed the way we think about political parties and the separation of powers in the American system. Mayhew not only demolished the conventional wisdom about political parties, that unified government was necessarily more productive than divided government, he examined a variety of alternative explanations for the patterns he found. His ideas have sparked a lively literature about the causes of legislative productivity. 2 years ago, his book, America's Congress, Actions in the Public Sphere, James Madison through Newt Gingrich, shows a new side to Mayhew's creativity. Here he shows how much influence real individuals have had on congressional actions, not the single-minded seekers of re-election featured in his Electoral Connection book, nor the stylized, anonymous, faceless individuals that populate formal theories of political institutions, but real, living and breathing politicians who are motivated by something other than re-election. Mayhew not only shows that they matter, but works to devise and test explanations for variations in the supply of these entrepreneurial activities. The new message is simple. Single-minded seekers of re-election explain lots of broad patterns in legislative studies, but there's much that requires theorizing from alternative assumptions about human behavior. He's written 3 other books. His very first, Party Loyalty Among Congressmen. His second, Placing Parties in American Politics, which is surely the definitive study of party organization in the 50 states. And one just due out this summer, or just published this summer, American Electoral Realignments, a critique of the genre. It is hard to think of anyone since V.O. Key who has had as great an impact on the study of political parties and political institutions as Key's most famous student, David Mayhew. Both scholars share a remarkably rare combination of theoretical ambition, careful scholarship, substantive breadth, deep expertise, and elegant writing. I introduce to you David Mayhew.
Thanks so much, Doug. I devised a speech today under the title of Supermajority Rule in the Senate. Now, I haven't written about this before. I've been thinking about it, and I'm trying to think about it. I decided to tackle a topic that I hope is of some historical and theoretical interest and of current policy importance, and that might have interested James Madison. That is supermajority rule, not ruled by a majority, but by more than that on many things, often at least in the Senate. Now, think of Madison, checker and balancer though the great man was, this feature of American life would probably have surprised him. That is supermajority rule in the Senate. It's not in the Constitution, it's not in the Federalist. It might also have distressed him. But we have it today. We have, you know, the routine, the filibusters, the cloture, the familiar 60 now, the 3/5 rule absolute in the Senate to break the cloture, budget matters aside, some other matters aside, but there we are. It's part of our lives. It's become commonplace. For example, a couple of months ago, the Washington Post writing about the failure of an inheritance tax proposal. This is a Bush item in the Congress, in the Senate. Quote, "The vote on the president's proposal was 54-44, 6 votes short of the 60 required for passage." It's as if it had been written in the Constitution. And this has become routine coverage by the papers, back in Clinton's first Congress. So this is a particularly, I would say, prominent set of instances. Recently, a bunch of pieces, legislative measures died in the Senate through the failure to get the 60, campaign finance reform, lobbying reform, product liability, striker replacement, labor management relations item. I don't think health care is on that list. It couldn't get the votes in the House, but still, there were a lot of casualties in the Senate that year, and so on. We know about this. This subject of the 60 has been treated recently elegantly and convincingly by Keith Crable, one of the best books in recent years, in fact ever, I think, on the U.S. Congress, where Keith talks about the filibuster pivot, the 60 point in the Senate, theorizes about that, and adduces convincing evidence about what the state of affairs is today. There it is, the 60 rule. And it's not majority rule, yet among the public, and I think even largely in political science, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of interest in this supermajority phenomenon, the 60, or concern about it. This we might think of as a cemented-in hurdle of current times to lawmaking in the United States. It's treated as a matter of fact, a part of the very complicated set of things that go on in D.C. Maybe Madison wanted it for that matter. He wanted a lot of other checks and balances, but not this one. It was Madison, so far as I can tell, was a majority rule person, except for the obvious constitutional exceptions to that in the House and in the Senate. Having the Senate was enough. You didn't need more, probably, from Madison's standpoint. I think one reason we don't think about this too much or get concerned about it too much, the supermajoritarianism, is this view. It's that, well, in the past, wasn't it even worse? We've got the 60 today. But from the standpoint, that is, of majority rule, after all, before that, between 1917 and 1975, that is the long middle of the 20th century, there was a 2/3 cloture rule. It says it required 67 when the senators became 100 in number, rather than the current now 60. That's even worse, isn't it? And then back before 1917, for over a century of American history, there was no cloture rule at all. And things must have been even worse back then, I suspect many people would opine. And now in political science, we're hearing a fair amount about a 2/3 filibuster pivot point, at least during this long half of the 20th century, from 1917 to 1975. The conventional wisdom probably would be, in political science as well as in the public, that if Senate majorities, floor majorities, have it rough today, then they used to have it, if anything, even rougher. So possibly inferring from that, why worry? But I want to ask, just briefly, and treat today the question, is it really true that before recent times, the majorities in the Senate had it worse, or even had it so bad as they seem to so often today in passing things? I, for one, doubt it. This is a general impression, looking over American history and reading. Across a wide range of issues, I doubt that the Senate of past generations had any anti-majoritarian barrier as concrete or as decisive or as consequential as today's rule of 60. I would guess that majorities, if anything, seem to have had it easier in previous times. So I'm not so sure that I'd opt for equality rather than easiness, but maybe it was easier in recent times. Consider off the top, for example, from the 1820s through the 1930s, the long series of contentious tariff bills that were passed by the system and by the Senate, ordinarily by very narrow majorities. Very contentious stuff, narrow majority victories. There's a paper at this conference by Eric Schickler and Greg Guerrero about that, by the way, that I'm going to read as fast as I can. I've talked to Eric about this. But this subject is being addressed by those people with a statistical base, which I don't have here. Now, this is an extremely difficult subject, a majority rule or its lack in past times, on both logic grounds and evidence grounds. What I'd like to do is to address it here briefly today by taking a probe, and it is that, into a Senate of one particular past Congress with an eye for the actions and the strategies of majorities and minorities. And the Congress I want to look at is that of 1937-38, a long time ago. Actually, I was born during it, in May 1937, just after Roosevelt's great landslide victory of 1936, which brought, you may have read, and some may remember, a House that had only 89 Republicans in it out of 435, and a Senate at one point with only 16 Republicans in it out of the then 96 senators. It's amazing. It was the partisan distribution was unique over the last century and a half. That Congress is interesting, 37-38, for a couple of other reasons, I think. One is that the aspiration level for passing things was very high among the New Dealers. Here, they had big majorities. They could do even more than they'd done previously, and they had an agenda. Secondly, the Senate, it was thought, widely thought anyway, was going to be the blocking institution on at least some of the New Deal legislative items, if any place was, except maybe the court. The House was widely thought to be in Roosevelt's pocket. So there was a lot of, the spotlight was on the Senate, the pressure was on the Senate, some of these items, particularly the couple I want to talk about here. I want to talk about briefly what happened and why in this, and speculate about why in this 75th Congress of 1937-38, and I want to address the three highly public and controversial legislative drives of that Congress briefly. One is an anti-lynching bill. It was not a New Deal priority. The second is Roosevelt's court-packing bill, which was, and the third is Roosevelt's executive reorganization bill, which was a high executive White House agenda item then also. Those three. Again, it needs to be done briefly. I want to give you sketches of these three cases, which bring out some facts or factoids that are of some interest, I think, or relevance in thinking about this subject. And then I want to present three theoretical arguments having to do with the strategies of the political actors and the context in which they were plied that may throw some light on what happened or didn't, I hope anyway, in 1937-38. All this is in the service of wondering about whether majorities had it rougher back then or equally rough or tougher or whatever than they do now with our hardened 60 rule. The first of these three I'll discuss is the anti-lynching bill. This can be very brief since what happened matches everybody's image of civil rights legislating back then. The 1930s had brought some very grim lynchings, a serious national civil rights drive to enact anti-lynching legislation came into place in the early and mid-30s. In January 1938, with a fair amount of public steam behind it, an anti-lynching bill reached the Senate floor. The Southern Democrats, remember those were the days when blacks were disfranchised and suppressed in the South, and the whites in the Democratic primaries wanted to keep things that way, so far as anybody could tell. The Southern Democrats in the Senate said they would talk forever about this. In fact, Senator Ellender of Louisiana almost did. It went on for several days, very hard to shut him up. The White House was tepid on this anti-lynching bill. The Democratic leadership tried to get the Senate to work on it, but nobody pressed very hard. A casual enforcement there was of the anti-filibuster provisions that could be used in the Senate at that time. After a couple of weeks, in January of 1938, 20 of the Northern Democrats leaked, a story came out in the Times, 20 of the Northern Democrats, that's more Republicans than there were in total, notice, they folded. Saying, in effect, let's move on to some of the important New Deal economic agenda items. The Southerners dug in and the Northerners vacated is what happened. It was thought at the time that if the thing had come to a vote, there were probably 70 votes in the Senate, yes, for this anti-lynching bill. But cloture, in fact, failed twice. The thing went on for 6 weeks. It finished. The bill was killed. That was it. This was a classic, maybe the classic, anti-civil rights filibuster of the 20th century. It had all the motions there, all the particulars, including the length. This is a bill that the House had signed, and Roosevelt would have the House had passed, and Roosevelt would have signed if he gotten a chance. All right. The second bill, again, that was a sketch, is the court-packing bill. The court-packing bill of 1937. The story is more prolonged, it's more complicated, it's more confusing. This was Franklin Roosevelt's #1 agenda item of calendar 1937. The problem, you'll remember, is that the Supreme Court had been knocking down some of the major Supreme Court accomplishments, and Roosevelt, we've got to do something about it, so he sent in a court bill saying, the court has got 9 justices, I want 6 more, give me 6, there'll be 15, I'll appoint the other 6. That was a court-packing plan. It was a solution for the obstructiveness of the court to New Deal aspirations and accomplishments. Give me 6 justices. This inaugurated one of the major, it was a bill, a measure sent over to the Hill. This inaugurated one of the major political controversies of American history. in calendar 1937 and involved was a legislative drive. There were 3 phases. In February and March of 1937, the bill went to the Senate first for complicated reasons. A very hostile Senate opposition formed. Leave the Supreme Court alone. Conservatives were there, others were there, progressives were there. A cross-party coalition formed against the Roosevelt drive, led by that old progressive Democratic Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana, and signed on to by many Democrats, including proportionally as many Northerners as Southerners, I think, as it happens. The opposition set up a cross-party steering committee, a cross-party whipping system, and they took to the radio. National radio is a big thing then. You turn on the dial, and there's Senator Wheeler rattling on about the plan. There's Senator Glass of Virginia. There's Senator Vandenberg, the Republican of Michigan. There's Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the younger, of Massachusetts. There's Senator Bailey of North Carolina. They wouldn't shut up. The horse race coverage by the press, that is, who's winning on this one? It went on for weeks, a couple of months, January, February, in this February, March, in this phase, the horse race coverage, who's winning by the press, it took the form of wondering who's got a majority. It was widely believed there were about a third yes, a third no, and the other third don't know in the Senate. So the undecided third they would decide it. They would decide it, it was believed. April and May, phase 2 during the court packing drive. April, May, the court, you may remember, backtracked on some of its decisions, made it clear they were not going to block most of the New Deal from then on, and this took some of the steam out of the legislative drive, not surprisingly, and probably the anti-court packing plan lost its majority in the Senate at that point in April and May. But then phase 3, June and July of 1937, it's all 37, this one, Roosevelt insists anyway. He wants a bill. Give me a lesser bill. Give me one that will allow me to have one new incremental justice a year for the next few years anyway, and maybe I'll be satisfied. At least that's all I can get. So that bill rattled around for a while. This was showdown time. The opposition on the Hill was just as unfavorable to that one, it seemed, as they had been to the more robust earlier version. And the minority in the Senate, the cross-party minority, it was a minority in June and July, most of the time anyway, headed by Senator Wheeler, digs in to stage a blocking filibuster. And the press breaks out in stories about the cloture rule, refreshing the public about the cloture rule. It turns out that Burton Wheeler of Montana was leading a force of probably 43 senators, that's out of 96, who were against the thing. The core of that 43 was referred to as a death battalion. They do virtually anything, it seemed, to block this bill. There was talk about 7 speaking teams of 5 each, with 8 senators in reserve, if needed, to block this thing in July, August, however it take, in 1937. But, to go on with the sketch, in the face of all this, it was not clear what would happen. It wasn't clear to the politicians, it was not clear to the D.C. press corps. This is amply documentable. For example, on July 1st, Alsop and Catlett, who covered this in depth for the Times, this is a quote, the two sides were so evenly matched and placed that no one could tell how the fight would end, period, end quote. Or from the Herald Tribune of that time, veterans are inclined to agree that no filibuster really succeeds except at the end of a term. Meanwhile, the horse race coverage by the press of this still centers on the 49 figure. There's a majority in the Senate. I think I remember correctly. This is different from what happened in 1964-65 during those classic filibusters in my life that I can remember, 64-65, when the horse race coverage was on the 67 figure. That is, can they get to 2/3 rather than as it was back in 37 and whether they can get the majority. Majority Leader in the Senate, Joe Robinson, cracks down. He says we're going to make people stay overnight and force the rules to try to crack a filibuster if it comes. Senator Pittman, who's the pro tem presiding officer in the Senate for a while, Jack Geiner had gone off, the vice president to Texas for a vacation. Pittman comes down with some rulings that are unfavorable to the obstructive minority. The majority leader says it will persist until it wins. Senator Wheeler meets with President Roosevelt to see if they can come up with a compromise. The answer is no. They couldn't come up with a compromise because each guy thinks he's winning. And at one late point, the opposition, Wheeler people, they did panic and offer a compromise. They're getting a little shaky, even sitting there in their 43. In the event, to finish this sketch, of course, the bill died in July 1937 in the Senate, and that is at least partly because Majority Leader Robinson died. He was leading the fight for the White House, had a heart attack. It struck everybody of the heap that Joe had gone down with this cause. After that, the cause wasn't going very well. Also, probably simultaneous at that time, the bill had been flagging in public opinion and may have lost its Senate majority anyway. That's in about the second week of 1937. It's difficult to say. There's also some evidence by that time the bill would have had a hard time getting through the House if it had gotten over there, which it did not. So here's another failed bill of the three. Actually, all three of them failed. The third instance is the Executive Reorganization Bill of 1937-38. This can be a bit briefer. This is another major agenda item for the White House. This is also seen, executive reorganization, it was seen as a power grab by the opposition, just as the court packing bill was seen as a power grab by the opposition. What the Executive Reorganization Act would have done in its ambitious early phase was for one thing, to allow Roosevelt to reorganize at will all the agencies, units of the executive branch, including, as I remember, the regulatory agencies, not giving Congress a veto over it. There was something that was called a congressional veto, but what it amounted to if Congress could pass a bill trying to block something if it wanted, but it ripped the veto by the White House. It was a very, very ambitious thing by the White House to give Roosevelt this authority, and the opposition didn't like it. There materialized in the Senate another opposition led by Burton Wheeler, the ex-progressive, still progressive probably in some ways, senator from a Democrat from Montana. And this controversy came to a boil in March 1938. It's a year later than court packing. The thing had been on a back burner for quite a while. It went to a front burner in March of 1938. There were several weeks of Senate debate, heated debate, in March, late February, March of 1938. This Executive Reorganization Bill came to be called or referred to quite commonly in the press as the Dictator Bill. Somebody put that label on it. One headline I came across was, "Wheeler warns Senate against dictatorship." That's what they were saying in 1938 about this. As it happens, this bill was being considered against the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938, and everybody was watching what was going on and applying the nouns and the verbs to the American situation. Democratic Senator Walsh of Massachusetts, said, here's a quote from Senator Walsh, that to enact this bill would be to plunge a dagger into the very heart of democracy. You're a Democratic president and you get your party members from Massachusetts saying that, you may be in some trouble. And some trouble was happening in this part of 1938. The Senate opposition had some 40 votes on this as it happened. That's what they thought turned out to be true, some 40. That's out of the 96. Their strategy, their blocking strategy, was entirely majoritarian. I don't see any evidence of thinking about it, trying to stage obstruction or a filibuster. They had a well worked out and much talked about strategy of trying to get rid of this bill, or at least take some of the stuffings out of it, through seriatim amendments, each of which might command, if they were lucky, a majority in the Senate against a big portion of the bill, although the opposing majorities wouldn't be identical to each other in personnel. That was their strategy. Well worked out, interesting strategy. They went at it. One amendment lost by only 4 votes. Finally, the bill did pass the Senate in March it was, of 1938 by 48 to 43. 48, if everybody had been there, it was calculated, it would have been 50 to 46. There were some sicknesses and people away. Then, surprisingly, as it happens, that's the third bill that went down. The bill died in the House a few weeks later. It went over to the House, and it was voted down in the House, which was thought to be in Roosevelt's pocket, by 204 to 196 in April of 1938. It was one of Roosevelt's great legislative setbacks, the killing of executive reorganization then. A watered-down bill did pass, by the way, a year later in 1939, which is very important. It was watered down but not negligible. But the ambitious bill lost. It wasn't very ambitious, actually, by the time the House voted on it. A lot had been taken out of it, but it lost. In the last weeks of this, there was a crescendo of of press and interest group opposition. There were people wandering around in D.C. wearing Paul Revere costumes, warning about what was happening, the third crisis of American history, all this was going on. At any rate, the thing was finally blocked by this interest group, public relations move, and a House vote. So much for the Senate as the great blocking body on something as contentious and as front and center as this in 1938. Those are the three sketches that, and this may give new meaning to the term sketchiness, to the way I did this, but there they are. All three bills failed in 37, 38. Two of them in the Senate. All three of them involved legislative drives featuring large, committed Senate minorities. No question about that. Legislative drives featuring large, committed Senate minorities. There's a successful filibuster against the Anti-Lynching Bill. There was a kind of a mess on court packing. It's not easy to tell exactly what was causing what in the demise of that bill. And there was no sign of attempted obstruction in the Senate on executive reorganization, which in fact died in the House, assisted by interest group activity and public opinion. What we don't see here in the set of these three is anything like a routine of 1/3 plus 1 of the use of a 1/3 plus 1 blocking move. We don't see that. Today we might. Today the 60 is so common that posting the figure 41 against the 60 by somebody in the Senate, usually the minority party now, is often enough just to bring things to a stop in their tracks. All right. Now, I want to do something brief. This is a brief speech. How to account for this variety of patterns back in 1937, 38? And I don't think anything can do that completely, and much mystery remains about this, something of a puzzle to me, what was going back on, how to reason and come up with causes, explanations about what was going back then. But I did come out of the records. I pored over the records of the newspapers for weeks on this, and the secondary work. There's a lot of secondary work on the couple of good books on the court packing drive, for example. I came out of the records with three general ideas or conjectures, theoretical offerings of a sort that might help to give some order to what was probably going on in this panoply of events back in 37, 38. Now, each of them, it occurs to me, involves relaxing an assumption that is an assumption often made in studying legislative behavior. Each of the ideas I want to put forth here involves relaxing an assumption that's often made in studying by political scientists legislative behavior. But the three thoughts I've got here, conjectures, are quite different from each other in the kind of territory they cover. The first is this one. That the first idea. It's not unfamiliar, but I want to press it. The Senate, with its rules that obviously do allow slowdowns, even if things can't be automatically blocked by all the time by 131, 1 plus 1 or whatever, its rules allow slowdowns, is unusually good at accommodating differences in intensity. It's better than the House, at least since 1890, at accommodating intensity. Now, I think it is true, as Tulloch Buchanan argued a long time ago, that legislatures in general are pretty good at accommodating differences in intensity, better than referendum systems. And it's one of the things that happened. One of the reasons for having legislatures, after all, not the only one, but one of them, is that they do allow such accommodations through log rolling or through its equivalent, through some kind of cross-issue trading. That's what happens to a large extent in legislatures. The assumption I'm saying that needs to be relaxed here, and it's really quite surprisingly prominent in writing about the American legislatures, is that members in a legislature have equal intensities on any issue and across issues. It's really quite surprising. It's like crabgrass. It needs to be rooted out probably. It doesn't fit reality very well, I think. I think this point about differential intensity in the Senate is, again, perhaps obvious, but it's often skimped on. Now, I think this largely accounts for substantially anyway, accounts for the Senate's zero outcome record on civil rights for several generations, all the way from no civil rights bill between 1875 and 1957, even though there were tries at some points during that long lifetime span. largely accounts. The situation, certainly in 1937-38, and those of my age who were familiar with it in our youth, after 1937-38, is that the Southern members cared a lot about civil rights. They were against it, cared a lot. They go to the wall, and the Northerners on average cared little. African Americans in the South could not vote. There weren't that many African Americans in the North. Certainly very few in a lot of states that supplied senators from the high plains and the mountain states, for example. In back of the whole politics, in short, was disfranchisement of African Americans in the South and small numbers still in the North. That was in back of it. So the Southern members cared a lot. The Northerners on average little. As a plausible indicator of intensity, one does always wonder, as economists do, whether intensity can be seen. After all, is there any way to look at it, to measure it, to find out whether it's there? It's a vexing matter. A plausible indicator of intensity at the extreme is this, and this is an instance of the extreme. The Dixie senators, the Southern senators, were willing, they were even eager to talk forever and stay up all night. That is, they would do everything. And I think an interesting aspect of trying to figure out whether intensity is really there or whether people are dissembling, which again one always does have to wonder about, these people are not dissembling, is that this commitment by the Dixie senators seems to have been electorally induced, in the sense that the Southern senators could have gotten themselves into electoral trouble back home by not filibustering against civil rights bills for a long middle passage of the 20th century. So you see people you look back on as banner left liberals like Claude Pepper and Hugo Black in the Senate, making long anti-civil rights filibuster speeches in the middle 1930s. Whether they believe what they're saying is another matter, but they thought on the evidence, they thought they had to say it, and at some length, and so they did it in the middle 1930s, late 1930s. They had to do it. It was electorally induced. There's a sense in which what we're seeing here is a kind of electorally induced weighted voting in the Senate when constituents back home, enfranchised ones, think so strongly about something. Northern senators, on the other hand, what they tended to do is 1937, 38, and also otherwise, to take a look at the time and energy it would take to match the Southerners in order to try to break a filibuster and to say no. The costs were too high. For one thing, as a personal matter, it was too much work. Also, there could be health costs. Surprisingly prominent in the discussions back in 37, 38. A lot of the senators were having cardiac problems, no air conditioning. The summer was terrible. And in fact, remember, Joe Robinson died in the summer of 1937 fighting for Roosevelt's court-backing scheme. It was dangerous to get too thick into either filibustering activity or anti-filibustering activity. But beyond personal costs, there are policy costs. I mean, as a theoretical matter, I think the policy costs are are just vital to the history of civil rights legislation or non-legislation for several generations there. The cost, Northerners would come to see, or many of them would, that the cost of ignoring other agenda items is too high. That is spending another 3 weeks staying up all night to try to break a Southern filibuster, which probably wouldn't work anyway, provided the costs were too high. So let's switch to some other agenda item. Became the signature way for nominal civil rights supporters to abandon civil rights in the Senate, all the way from 1891 up through at least the 1940s. You see it time and again. Is, for example, in 1891, some of the Republicans would flake off. We want the tariff more than we want civil rights, so let's do it. The Republicans are pressing things in those days, after all, civil rights bills. Or we want silver, the Republican silver rights. You look up and they've gone off the team in 1890-91. In the 1930s, it was Northern Democrats, Republicans, progressive Republicans were saying, no, we've got to deal with the New Deal economic legislation. That's pressing. In 1935, relief of the population is a pressing matter. Let's not spend all this time doing something else. We need the relief bill right now. 1937, it's housing, farm bills come in. You can see it. It's a kind of key to the intensities in the Senate to watch the circumstances in which members will abandon one agenda item to switch to another. And again, it's very present there in 1937-38. Now, it seems to me the intensity consideration, it helps to take care of the distinctive pattern of the anti-lynching politics in 1938, or in the Congress of 1937-38. On court packing and on executive reorganization, the average intensities of the two sides, insofar as one can tell, it's a very spooky matter, were very much closer to equal. One guesses they were about equal for most of the, or much of the times of the legislative drives. One has to consider distribution among coalitions as well as median or mean intensities. That's true. It's complicated. But equality of the medians is probably something like the truth for these other drives through most of the courses of these other drives, something like that. And indeed, it seems a good bet that equality of intensities, more or less, insofar as one can tell, is ordinarily obtained on major legislative drives through American history that we remember, like those tariffs bills. Some people loved tariffs and others hated them. Probably there's something like an equality there over those many generations. It seems to me that without intensity differences of the sort that we saw on civil rights right up through probably the 1960s, what happened in the 1960s, among other things, I think is an equilibration of sexual intensities in the Senate on civil rights matters, 1964-65. Without intensity differences, effective minority obstruction in the face of concerted party or presidential drives seems to be very hard stuff, a very hard thing to pull off in the Senate in 1937-38, or for that matter, previously in the century and a half, almost that of American history. I haven't found a good instance throughout the previous century and a half, 1937-38, in which a president or a majority party really tried to pass something in the Senate and it got blocked by minority obstruction in a regular session of Congress. Now, the lame duck sessions are another thing. Some other interesting things are going on in the lame duckers. But in the regular, it's really quite rare to see it. Maybe Kansas became a state in 1856, which failed as an instance, but there's not much there. During the 20th century, or after starting in 1891, I think civil rights was virtually unique in this respect of offering great differential intensities of the two sides on the average in the Senate, with a minority in the Senate. After all, it was only 22. It wasn't even a third in the Senate, but they were usually pretty good blocking things. I think maybe the best additional candidate for intensity differential in legislation that's come up fairly commonly, at least during the last half century, let's start in 1950 now after the Taft-Hartley Act, is labor management relations. You may have noticed that a repeal of 14B having to do with right to work laws got killed by a filibuster in the 60s. Strike replacement dies in the 1990s. I think maybe that's true. The Democrats' commitment to labor management relations reform is shallow in the instance, and the Republican commitment, given the effectiveness of business corporations, after all, is pretty deep, but that's speculation. My second point, that's my first thought about differential intensity. The second one is this. And again, it's addressing the variety of patterns in 1937-38, and it's a theoretical point of a sort. It's this, that the rules environment in the Senate can be unclear. The rules environment in the Senate can be unclear. Yes, there existed a two-thirds cloture rule on the books in 1937-38. It had been there for 20 years. Didn't that mean that a determined 1/3 + 1 minority of the Senate could block legislative measures? Not so fast. Any words on a piece of paper are one thing, but the hard-headed expectations of politicians about how the Senate will actually operate are another. And it's the hard-headed expectations of politicians about the Senate will operate that we're seeing so much in the coverage and the dynamics of these legislative drives. In fact, in the case of the court-packing bill, it wasn't clear to the politicians or to the D.C. press corps what would happen if 1/3 + 1, and it was even more than that, it was 43 of these characters, would line up to try vociferously, vehemently. This is not small stuff for them. The stakes are very high to block. Now, I think that was at least because nobody could be sure what a determined floor majority in the Senate, in league with a friendly Senate presiding officer, would do in a pinch. There are two possibilities. One, the rules of the Senate could be manipulated in venturesome and surprising ways to combat a filibuster. Here I think of what Bill Riker wrote about heristhetics, about manipulation of rules and principal manipulation of rules. But two, I think this is a different point, conceptually a different point. The rules could be changed. The rules could be changed on the spot, not a matter of manipulation, but of rules creation. It's to help suppress obstructive minorities. A majoritarian coup d'etat, in short, throughout the history of the Senate, this is probably still true, was not absolutely out of the question in 1937-38. There had been such in the past in various legislative bodies, In the House in 1890 with the Reed rules, that was a majoritarian coup d'etat. It wasn't manipulation of the rules, it was a creation of rules. There's yesterday the minority had obstructive rights, today they don't. It's an abolition of rights. The same thing happened in the House of Commons in 1881. Very much like the Reed rules in 1890, the leadership of the majority of the House of Commons said no, they wouldn't let the Irish Republicans obstruct anymore, so they changed the rules in effect on the spot. Something like this happened in 1908 in the Senate, where Nelson Aldrich was absolutely determined to put through a currency bill. Made 3 different moves that were rules violations or changes on the spot in a very interesting episode in 1938. Beyond that, there could be middle-level rulings of the Senate chair. I would not majoritarian coup d'etat quite or maybe lesser instances of it. Middle-level rulings by the chair in the Senate, unfriendly to minorities, and these rulings crafted on the spot. New rulings, new rules, new situations come about through rules. In the history of the Senate, by the way, it's a very interesting thing. Who are those vice presidents and what do they want? One of the most important constitutional places of roles of a vice president is to figure out what the Senate rules are. And maybe get upheld by a majority, maybe swatted down by one. But what the VP or the President Pro Tem does is of considerable political consequence sometimes. And what the floor majorities are willing to do can be of political consequence sometimes. In 1930, rulings, middle-level rulings, as recently as 1935, there had been a chair ruling unfriendly to minority obstruction. And in fact, during the court-packing saga, as I told you, Key Pittman, the pro tem from Nevada, came down with some rulings unfriendly to the obstructive minority. I think they're still in the books, or still there in the Senate. I looked in Floyd Riddick, and last I knew they're still there. Some inventions, in short, in July of 1937 that stuck, having to do with the rights of minorities there. So, in the face of this, who could be sure what to expect in the instance of an obstruction move? I think one way to look at it is that the two-thirds cloture rule back then, it didn't have the sureness of the two-thirds treaty ratification figure in the Constitution or the two-thirds veto override in the Constitution. Those are written in stone. You can't get around them, the two-thirds. But the two-thirds cloture, well, it seems to be another thing. Back in the late 30s, it was custom for quite a while for the APSR, in one of its issues, to print a review of what happened in the recent Congress and to analyze it a little bit. And the political scientist, who's named John McDermott, looking back at this court packing drive that failed in 37, had this to write. It's on the efforts by Majority Leader Robinson and the President Pro Tem Pittman. Their rules maneuvers to try to shut down, do what they could to shut down the minority. They didn't shut down. Of course they didn't. Joe Robinson died before, consequentially, what was going to happen did happen on this front. In the end game of court packing in 1937, here's what John McDermott, the political scientist, wrote. Senator Robinson's death, however, suddenly destroyed his majority and ended the drama. It turns out some of the votes were in Joe's pocket. Wasn't sure where they go with Joe died. To go on with the quotation, in the failure to complete this experiment in defeating a filibuster by a novel interpretation of the regular Senate rules, it is possible that a valuable precedent for the future was lost. An analysis by the political scientist covering it at that time. In the face of all this, it seems to me in the face of all this, 1/3 plus 1 strategy of filibustering to block something was risky. It was risky. Now, a filibuster plan, it could be, as for strategists of that time, this seems to be what they were doing, it could be tucked away as a hole card, that might or might not work. But the prudent way, the dominant strategy, and the evidence of the two Wheeler drives against court packing, executive reorganization, to block a bill was to aim for let's call it a nay-saying majority in the Senate, to go for the 49. Instinctively, they went for the 49, to try to reach the 49 to kill. This is what by majority rule in the Senate, the majority loses. This is what both the Wheeler coalitions, again, on court packing and executive reorganization did mostly in applying their strategies through the many months. For analytic purposes, the assumption here that I've been talking about that needs to be relaxed is an assumption of fixed rules in the Senate. Fixed, rigid, rigorous, written in stone rules in the Senate. You have to worry about that. But now to finish off, to aim for a naysaying majority in the Senate. Don't try to obstruct 1/3 plus 1 or something. Try to get the 49 out of the 96, as you needed to do in 1937-38 if everybody was well and in town. That leads to my point 3. It is that often on a highly prominent issue, this is in Senate history, the best blocking strategy for a sizable Senate minority is to try to shape public opinion. Now, to say this is to relax an assumption that, a third assumption here, that the public or politicians responsive to the public have fixed views on public issues. And very often they don't. Often the public, after all, is a blank, or at least very much of a blank. It'll vary on how much the public is a blank. After many generations of tariff bills, probably there's a lot written on the blank out there. Court packing, that was a new experience, to have to worry about court packing, or for that matter, executive reorganization, which didn't achieve the prominence, by the way, in the public that the court packing drive did. Now, it's often a successful opposition, or for that matter, promoting congressional strategy, has hinged on shaping public opinion. And it seems to me that kind of consideration needs to be endogenized into the political situation in order to get a good grip on what majority and minority strategies can be in the Senate. Now, this is obvious to the Wheeler-led folks in 1937 and 1938 on court packing. 1937 on court packing. They didn't say in 1937, we've got the 33 senators. They had 33 senators almost from the start in 1937 against court packing. They didn't say we've got the 33 senators and you can't roll over us. You can't roll over us. Think to our current times. Bob Dole was saying that, the equivalent of that in 1993. I've got 41. You can't touch me. We didn't hear that from the Wheeler folks in 37, 38. Rather, what they did, they headed for the radio to make their case very early on. Again, you tune in, you twirl the dial, and there's Glass, and there's Bailey, and there's Vandenberg. They're saying speakers all over the country. Styles Bridges shows up in New York, which must have been a new experience for him. What might happen is that a favorable trend, and to be sure, the senators were not the only ones trying to massage public opinion in this juncture or any other juncture, but the senators are very key to the whole business in 1937 on court packing. Very key to it all, trying to shape public opinion. A favorable trend in public opinion might, for one thing, it might supply a naysaying Senate majority. In fact, I think that's largely what happened, finally in July in 1937. It's what happened in 1938 in defeating executive reorganization in the House. Finally, a naysaying House majority was answering to public opinion. Probably that's true. There are polls to show it. Or short of that, a favorable public opinion trend might affect whether a filibuster, in fact, could be marshaled and could be successful down the line. And whether one can be marshaled and be successful, after all, can be a consequence of the state of public opinion. Will senators go out on a limb for it? What is the intensity differential in the Senate at a certain time as a consequence of evolution of public opinion? I think probably actually by mid-July 1937 on court packing, the opposition had higher average intensity than the pro at that point. It's probably true for what it's worth. Intensity differential can be to some degree confected by by shaping public opinion over a considerable period of time. Now, this way of strategizing, we've got to go to the radio, et al., and so forth, was second nature to the Wheeler-led oppositions of both 1937 and 1938. And it was brilliant, and it was a brilliant and successful operation on the part of the Wheeler people in 37, particularly in 37, killing court packing. Now, that's not an entirely strange thing, because after all, we see in our own times, we think of court packing, and not court packing, Clinton's health care plan in 1993-94, which died, finally, you'll remember, not in the Senate, it didn't get there, well, it got there a little bit, but mostly I think it died in the House. But on that one, the Dole-Gingrich opposition, which emerged fairly quickly on health care, had some of these same characteristics that we see in the Wheeler-led opposition of 37-38. Dole Gingrich, they not the radio, but they got out there in media campaigns in cahoots with other people, including Harry and Louise, as it happened in 1993-94. You may remember those ads. But the Senate and House leaders, House leader in this instance, 93, 94, they went for public opinions. You may have read Larry Jacobs and Bob Shapiro's book on that, about the importance, I'm sure if you haven't, if you're interested in this subject or even otherwise, about the importance of in the minds of the leaders of the parties of the House and Senate in 93, 94, of shaping public opinion on this health care matter, which also is very strange to people after all. Clinton's health care plan had some of the attributes of the court-packing plan of Roosevelt. Very strange. Nobody had seen anything quite like it before. Comparing 93, 94 with 37, 38, looking at the public opinion drives, some things don't seem to change that much. And as long, in fact, you see it, I think this, taking to the airwaves or the equivalent at pastimes thereof, you can see this sort of thing all the way back in the 1790s with the politics involving the Jay Treaty. Both sides, they went, in effect, they did the equivalent of going on the radio in the interest of getting something through Congress in 1795, 1796. Media technologies controlling for them, some things don't seem to change that much, in that case, the highly prominent bills. But my focus here has been on the particular Congress of 1937-38, and my three-point argument about it, to sum up, is the following. Look to intensity differences. In short, think about relaxing the assumption that intensities among members will be equal across them on an issue or across issues. Think about relaxing. Secondly, look to the potential creation of rules, not just manipulation of rules, but creation of rules on the spot, if need be, to serve a purpose. This involves a relaxation of an assumption of fixed rules within which politicians work. Thirdly, look to the shaping of public opinion. That is, and this relaxes an assumption that public opinion is fixed on matters under consideration on Capitol Hill. In making these three analytic moves, there are three or four other moves. I know Bruce Oppenheimer has a nice piece about how back in those times, or back until fairly recently, the agenda was a lot smaller on the Capitol Hill. So it was easier to let people talk for a while and go on and bloviate and blather and so forth. The cost of it weren't so high. Nonetheless, I do see these trades in 37 and otherwise in the mid-30s, 38, they wanted to get away from civil rights and anti-lynching so they could go to other agenda items that they really wanted to get to. There's a trade down there by them. Making these analytic moves may help to suggest why Senate majorities may not have had it worse back then than now with our hard 60 rule, and they may even indeed have had it better.